Hey guys, how are my arc builders out there doing? I like that phrase, arc builders. If any of you have have come to a fuller revelation of knowledge and truth, and you've searched the scriptures to see whether those things are so, and you're trying to get this information out there to people, especially to our Christian brothers and sisters who may have had a compartmentalized version of the gospel, a limited version of the gospel. You're an ark builder. So, what I want to talk about today is irrational isolation and the absence of accountability. I might make this into two videos because I like making these short and sweet videos. It doesn't always happen, but these are two topics that some people believe are signs of deception, and they're not. And so, as I've said with all the other topics that we've been talking about, the beginning is going to be a denunciation or an accusation. Those who are indoctrinated or bound by tradition, those who are a part of this churchianity system is a term that a lot of people like to use, churchianity, who are a part of that modern mainstream institution, a commercial setting or a corporate setting. Those who are part of that system, they might suggest that if you believe something that if you have a new belief that causes you to disengage from your fellowship of believers, basically if you quit going to their church, then it's a form of isolation, which ultimately reflects the belief itself. So basically, if you come to a new belief and you start to pull away from the crowd that you're a part of, supposedly it's going to, in their eyes anyway, it is going to basically verify whether your new belief is true or not. So if you isolate yourself from them, then it basically shows that your new belief is untrue, because a new belief system would not pull you away from the fellowship. Right? You see what's happening there? Presumably your behavior began with deception. You embraced a fringe belief that led you to an elitist position, and you allowed it to pull you away from your fellowship with others. And furthermore, it would also appear that you're in rebellion against God and his delegated figures of authority. If you don't adhere to the hierarchical structure that's commonly associated with modern Christian establishments, then you've displayed insubordination. So by default, traditionalists, they basically consider these to be visible signs of deception. And we're going to talk about that today. Just going to get to it now. And depending on your background, it's possible that you may feel the need to willingly disassociate yourself from your local church assembly, or you may feel forced to separate yourself. For me, I guess it was kind of a variation of both. I began to distance myself from my local fellowship in pursuit of a closer knowledge of truth. Of course, the leadership considered this to be irrational isolation. But I mean, it's like, the way I look at it, it's necessary separation. And there's a difference. Irrational isolation is kind of the negative side, but necessary separation is the positive side. For me, it wasn't productive to remain affiliated with a group that was not willing to grow. And you may know, that the organization I was a part of just teaches that their core belief system is the full revelation of truth, and that all other Christians need to adopt their belief system. And from there, you can't really grow. Any growth is dependent upon whether or not you've embraced that. But it came to the point where I had very little in common with those who once called me brother. The book of Acts, it reveals that commonalities or things that you share, that's what brings believers together. Paul insisted that communion was unproductive when two groups or individuals can't agree. And I'm not talking about the communion as far as like taking them. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about using that term in general. Fellowship, I guess, would have been a better word. But just because you fellowship, or just because you distance yourself from certain parties, it doesn't mean you're isolating yourself from the body, even though some would probably try to make you believe otherwise. Now, in my experience, there were times during my situation when the leadership would sit down, they would discuss certain topics with me, but only to appease me. They're basically trying to appease me, to give me enough time so that they could convince me and bring me back to their systematic indoctrination. And it was basically a conditional relationship. They would listen long enough to reply, but never to understand, if that makes sense. And I guess once they realized that I was beyond the point of return, they began to rewrite the terms of our relationship. And it came to the point that I would have to be disfellowshipped, like in a subtle way, in a way that it would appear as though I was isolating myself. And, the doors were open to me and my family. They did make it clear that we were always welcome to attend services, but the downside was that our association was restrictive, because I wasn't allowed to discuss my beliefs about Scripture with any other member, regardless of my relationship with them. It was basically a one-sided, conditional relationship. I was expected to follow the same routine as everyone else, but keep my mouth shut through the entire process. And it doesn't really take an advanced level of spiritual insight to see the problem with this. I could go to a church but not talk about God. I would just have to go and be a robot and listen. And there's no room for growth when this is your only option. Now, the same pastor who established those conditions with me to attend his services, he would often make the statement as we were drifting further apart and we would see each other. He would always say, "Don't forget our agreement," and which was basically, I suspect it was his way of gauging me to see if I had changed my mind about discussing my new beliefs with his sheep. And I guess it wasn't an agreement. He just basically said, "I don't want you talking about your beliefs with any of my sheep." And apparently that was just our agreement. I don't know. But it was not long before I made the decision to close those doors. I mean, it was a dead end. And I closed those doors, and I haven't looked back since. At one point during my transition, it was suggested that if my beliefs were true, then we should hear reports about some type of revival associated with my new beliefs. If the information that I was uncovering was truly revealed by God, then it would have triggered a revival similar to the Pentecostal movement during the 1900s. Now, of course, the individual who suggested this, it was a Pentecostal. There was a story behind the Pentecostal the movement that started in the 1900s, and then there were a lot of revivals back then, and a lot of tongue talking, people speaking in tongues, and you would just hear a lot about this new movement that was growing and getting bigger. So for him to say that, it was basically his way of reasoning that a new denomination should surface in the same way if anything that I believed was true. But it wasn't surprising to hear this logic from someone whose line of thinking was shaped by that system itself. So, and ironically, part of coming out of the traditional mindset is recognizing the curse of denominationalism. So to that argument, I would respond by saying certain movements have emerged. If you're a truther, you already know. Essentially, each chapter in my book, there's a lot of different topics in here. Each chapter in this book, one talks about compartmentalization, one and cognitive dissonance, coming into the understanding of new information. One chapter talks about the sacred ancient texts and some of the books that have been removed from our Bibles, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and Jasher specifically. And there's a lot of good information in there. Another chapter talks about the giants and the Nephilim and the Watchers. Another chapter talks about Christology, because I believe that a lot of the Nephilim studies kind of spill over into our views of who Jesus the man is, and a lot of the I guess the idea that an incarnation happened, and so I'm not going to get into that, but there's just a lot in here, okay? And each chapter of this book is based on information that many Christian circles have observed, and a lot of people refer to this as the Truther movement, okay? And a lot of people refer to it as the Great Awakening, which again is just another name for the revelations that have become widespread. I'm not really partial to any label necessarily. If you want to call me a truther, fine. I don't care. I don't care. A truth seeker, whatever. I mean, but if you know, you know. If you're a truther, then you know that there is a movement that has surfaced in recent years. A lot of people are coming out of their former indoctrination. There are different ways to describe what's happening across the earth among different groups, but it only demonstrates exactly what was argued against me. Just because an individual isn't familiar with certain information or hasn't heard about a movement, it doesn't mean it's untrue or doesn't exist. If anything, it demonstrates the extreme level of compartmentalization by which that traditionalist has limited himself. So this guy who was telling me, well, what you believe is untrue, otherwise we'd have heard about it. There would have been a new movement. Well, it's like, well, open your eyes. There is. It's happening. People are coming out. A dear friend of mine, David Laser, I've added a few quotes in my book about from some things that he's had to say. And this one just stuck out. He said, sometimes the walls you build to keep people out end up being the very walls that imprison you. And this dear brother came out from the same organization that I was a part of. And he's just, I've watched him grow and grow and grow, and he's just embraced so much knowledge. And it's just good. It's like he sees. It's like God has opened his eyes. And this is the true definition of irrational isolation, shutting out any information that doesn't fit inside of one's compartment of truth. You know? So a lot of the accusers, the people who are saying you're isolating yourself, irrational isolation, have basically isolated themselves and compartmentalized themselves. And anything outside of that compartment is apparently false doctrine, and you're deceived if you believe anything other than what they preach. After leaving that institutional setting, the pastor and I, we communicated occasionally in the email, and he was mostly concerned about me keeping quiet, about me just don't share any of your information with the congregation. That's all. And I was kind of intrigued by his reasoning about my pursuit of knowledge. He said this. Okay, this is good. He said, if what you believe is of God, then I can do nothing to stop it. If what you believe is false, then it'll die. I'll leave it in the hands of God. Now, okay, if you know those words, if you know where that came from, most of you are probably familiar. But if you're not familiar, those were the same words of Gamaliel, the Pharisee, in the book of Acts. Despite that the apostles were commanded to stop preaching in the name of Jesus Christ, Yeshua Mashiach, Peter informed the council that he must obey God rather than men. Because that's what the Pharisee said to him. He said, he said to all of his guys. And that's what triggered the uproar. Peter said he was going to obey God and not men. In the council, they became furious, and they plotted to kill the apostles. And that's when Gamaliel suggested the alternative. He said in Acts 5:38, now I say unto you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found fighting against God. Okay, so comparing the striking resemblance there between the email that I received and Gamaliel's statement, it's overwhelming. It's really, if anything, it's revealing that he would use the same statement that a Pharisee made in opposition to the message of Christ. I think that's kind of funny, but oh well. Gamaliel was among a group of elites who rejected both the messenger and the message. So while they anticipated this message to die, it never did. The apostles continued to preach the gospel. And likewise, those today who can't understand what's occurring on a broader scale, they've displayed the same reasoning. Hence, this man who they can't accept that society has been misled by a Luciferian ministry. There are these ministers of propaganda. Even when prophecy is being fulfilled before their eyes, they're still, succumbing to that same indoctrination system that has kept them paralyzed. So, and those who don't conform to that system are viewed as the ones who are deceived. Now, those who do conform to that system, they're just going to continue down that same road of blind tradition, rejecting what God is unfailing. Just like the Pharisees in that instance where Gamaliel and those men rejected the message of Christ. It never died out. It just kept growing. So during the first century, the message, I wonder what they think, because during their life, it never did die down. They just kept seeing it grow. But And they lived the rest of their lives rejecting it, even though it never died down. So that's why I think the circumstances are ironic, is because this, you know, truth is not going to go away. It's going to continue to be exposed. And I am, for those whose eyes are open, those who are willing to embrace it, it's obvious it's not going away. There's just more truth coming in. It's spilling over, and people are still rejecting it because it doesn't fit inside their small compartment of truth. Truth. It can't be avoided. I mean, people can deny the evidence, but I mean, the behavior, it's no different than the Pharisees, who treated the message of Christ the same way. All right. This raises the question, because we're all in a current state of incompletion. I know a lot of individuals who have embraced certain aspects of truth, but may not be enlightened in other areas. Okay? I've encountered a lot of individuals who have embraced biblical cosmology, but they've never been introduced to the biblical Christology, or vice versa. Many people have become aware of the deception of the Trinity and oneness and things like that, but they might not have ever been exposed to the book of Enoch or the Nephilim agenda. Okay? Some people have come out from among the institutional church setting, but they may not have been introduced to Hebrew cosmology. So there are some people who have embraced some aspects. Some people have woken up to the deception of, like, the elite government control, but they can't admit that this elite mentality is within the modern churches. So, I mean, there's just many aspects of truth, a lot of deception that is being exposed. Some people are just embracing more than others. And it's a continual pursuit. I mean, we're seeing major doctrines resurface today. God is just bringing clarity about these subjects. Getting back onto the topic of isolation, though, let me talk about, if you remove yourself from an unfruitful situation, and apparently that constitutes isolation. In my situation, it happened kind of in a sequential order. I began to distance myself in pursuit of further knowledge, and in turn, I was accused of irrational isolation. And then I was shunned when it became evident that I wasn't willing to go back to my former conditions, I guess. But I guess the most disappointing behaviorism that I observed among those who I considered my church family was that many of my former brethren were convinced that their allegiance to the pastor was justifiable grounds for severing our friendship. Oh man. And I'm dealing with that right now with a certain individual. She is ready to cut me off. She has told my wife that, if Andy just can't stop with his wacky beliefs, I'm just going to have to block him and cut him off. And I'm just trying to open her eyes, But she did. I hate that. She told my wife the other day she's just going to have to cut me off. And that was, that's another topic I talked about. And she thinks I'm being crappy, and I'm not. I'm not being crappy. I'm just, if we're passionate about these things, we want people to see them. I want people to wake up. I want people to come out from the indoctrination. And the behavior is real. It's basically the dichotomy between cookie cutter traditionalists and non-conforming truth seekers. To them, I'm a backslider. But from my position, it makes sense why I would gradually become distant from the institution after embracing further information. And it basically explains how so many denominations have formed over the years. Two can't walk together unless they agree. That's scripture. Is it a sign of deception? No. If anything, it demonstrates the opposite, that God reveals truth to those who are willing to embrace it and come out of their compartments of truth. And without fail, traditionalists will always evaluate the circumstances according to the systematic structures that they've built. And those who don't abide by that system are viewed as insubordinate. And if you don't submit to the delegated figures of authority, such as the pastor, then you've basically, to them, you don't have any credibility. And it's why the Pharisees rejected Christ, because he didn't submit to human customs, to their customs, to the man-made traditions. And from their position, he was being rebellious to authority. Although his desire was for them to see the truth, they couldn't get past their traditions. And in turn, they rejected what God was trying to establish through him. And it's no different today. And nonconformists and traditionalists, they'll continue to kick against the pricks. And it looks like we're getting ready to go to the next section. There's one principle on which we can stand. God is always willing to open the doors for those who are willing to enter. But we got to, we have to allow some other doors to close first. It doesn't mean you're isolating yourself. It just means you're willing to close those doors. And that's where I'll leave it on this video. I hope it speaks to someone. I know I'm spitting out a lot of videos right now, probably more than anyone can keep up with, but for those who are still with me, thanks for watching these videos. I love you, and I'll talk at you soon.